Right. I'm very sorry to interrupt your tea break, as we said in the UK. But thank you so much, Alberto, for that very kind introduction. And above all, thank you for inviting me once again to take part in this Asymmetrie Association's great annual gathering. It's an absolute pleasure for me and an honor to be back with you all. I have already recognized several familiar faces and old friends, and I can also see very many new supporters here today of this excellent association. I also would like to thank our translators working very hard over there for their invaluable help for making life easier for everyone by removing language barriers. Alberto has asked me to share some thoughts with you today on the subject of inflation. The main reason for this choice of topic is clear enough. Since my last visit to the Asymmetrie conference 2 years ago, inflation has dominated the economic news. As the media coverage endlessly repeated, we have seen the highest inflation rates experienced since the 70s. I will explain why this common reference to the 70s is deeply misleading and may have contributed to what I see as the recent policy mistakes of the European Central Bank. Obviously, is the latest in a very long line of European Central Bank mistakes that will make life worse. But there is another reason for me to share some thoughts with you today about inflation. The second reason is personal and at the same time scientific. This year is the 10th anniversary of the publication by Princeton University Press of my book entitled Remembering Inflation. My timing with that book was bad. By 2013, the memory of inflation as a chronic and dire threat to welfare had become very distant. And for long years following that publication, the memory of inflation became even more remote. Then, the COVID pandemic brought my theme of remembering inflation back into fashion. That book titled Remembering Inflation was a play on words. It wasn't only about not forgetting past inflation experience and remaining mindful of the lessons of that experience. The title also alluded to the theme of the memory of inflation, generating expectations about future inflation. Countering such expectations requires a policy response based on transparent rules, which in turn create stability, credibility. The rule or anchor, almost universally adopted, was an inflation target pursued by central banks that became independent of governments. If people believed that inflation rates would be stably low, they would moderate their wage claims, and the dreaded wage price spiral, experienced in the 70s in the Italian experience, the notorious scala mobile would be avoided. For those of you interested in the history of macroeconomic thought, this shift from a discretionary to a more rule-based framework for policy, emphasizing credibility, transparency, and accountability, appears to be a direct recognition of the insights on rational expectations developed by the Nobel laureate Robert Lucas in a 1976 paper, and the time inconsistency problem identified by Finn Kinland and Edward Prescott in 1977. But before we go any further, let us look more closely at inflation targets. This will take us from the rarefied world of Nobel Prize winners in economics down into the rough reality of politics and chance. Why does the ECB, the European Central Bank, along with all other major central banks around the world, target an annual inflation rate of 2%? Why not make the inflation target, say, 0% or 10%? The factual historical answer to this question is that the European Central Bank itself decided to adopt that 2% target. Not much control there of any kind, democratic or otherwise. The European Central Bank's legal mandate, defined by international treaty, is to pursue undefined price stability. To stick with messy history, it appears that the choice of 2% originated in an offhand comment by this gentleman here, a certain Roger Douglas, in a television interview he gave in 1988 in his capacity as a finance minister of New Zealand. Anyway, bureaucrats and technocrats have decided for themselves what price stability means. Have they made the right decision about that? To put the same question another way, what is the ideal inflation rate? The question could be reformulated even more fundamentally along the line, why does inflation even matter? The orthodox answer revolves around the negative impact on welfare of uncertainty about prices. The decisions of economic actions that matter most for increasing long-run welfare, that is, people's living standards, are decisions about investments with a potential to enhance productivity. Such decisions may be hampered or inhibited by persistently high rates of inflation. But how high do inflation rates have to be to have this undesirable effect? Modern central bankers' answer to that question is higher than 2%. But there is no good empirical evidence supporting that view. On the contrary, a mass of evidence that I reviewed in my book 10 years ago and that has not been modified by subsequent research indicates that variations in the rate of inflation up to the level of around 5% do not have any material effect whatsoever, either positive or negative, on rates of real economic growth. To be sure, the evidence here needs careful handling due to nonlinearities, interaction effects with other growth determinants, and differences between short-run and steady-state relationship. But that overall finding remains robust. When annual inflation rates persist at higher levels, especially in double-digit percentages, a negative impact on welfare is more likely, not only for the reason already mentioned to do with inhibiting investment, but also for its adverse distributional consequences. That is, persistently high inflation penalizes mainly poorer people who do not own and cannot afford to buy much in the way of inflation-proof real assets to offset the effect of inflation in eroding the purchasing power of their wages. But all and any such welfare losses caused by stickily high inflation will be made much worse if the rate of inflation is not only elevated, but also volatile and therefore unpredictable. This means that a key focus of policymakers should be not so much on a given inflation target viewed with a reverence that was once accorded to the gold standard, but rather on preventing inflation from appearing to have got out of control. How can we know that inflation has got out of control? Having just considered the question of what is the right level of inflation to aim for, this further question about inflation getting out of control will be my second and last background point before getting to my conclusions, which will have to do with the perceived threat of another financial crisis focused on Italy's public debt and with the latest policy mistake of the European Central Bank. Price increases come in one of the two main forms. The first form is one-off increases in the price level, which then more or less settles at that higher level. The second form is where the price level persistently increases. The label inflation may be applied to both these two forms, but it is the second form to which the study of monetary economics is mainly relevant. And this is a kind of inflation that matters more in the real-life sense of long-run welfare outcomes, and such persistent inflation matters most when the pace of persistent price increases is also accelerated and or becomes volatile. This is what is meant by inflation getting out of control. It follows that whenever prices jump higher, it is vital to diagnose the causes correctly. Will this be a one-off change in the price level, or is there a threat of inflation feeding on itself in an uncontrolled spiral? When inflation rates started to rise sharply in 2021, there were good reasons to suppose that this inflation would be transitory. That is, a one-off increase in the price level. As a result of the COVID pandemic, the world economy experienced an enormous supply shock. Distortions and disruptions in the productions of goods and services caused price pressure in every item in the basket that makes up the consumer price index, starting in goods and then spreading to services. But as economies reopen after the pandemic lockdown, this supply bottlenecks could be expected to resolve themselves. Meanwhile, and similarly, the inflation driver on the demand side, coming from the other pandemic legacy of pent-up consumer spending, could be expected to be reabsorbed by normalizing supply. But already, from the outset of this inflationary experience of 21-22, the fact of inflation rates rising to the highest levels seen in half a century resulted in some commentators warning of a return of the 70s. Then something else happened, which was a scary echo of the 70s. This new development was a war in Ukraine, an energy price shock caused by the resulting American and European sanctions on Russia, just as the 1973 Yom Kippur war triggered the OPEC oil embargo. As a result, last year, inflation began to rise more quickly, with price rising spreading right across the basket. Companies found it easier to pass their rising costs onto consumers, as opposed to accepting lower profit margin. The idea that this inflation episode would be transitory went out of fashion. Now, central banks got seriously worried by the dreaded second-round inflationary effect of a wage price spiral as seen in the great inflation of the 70s. And they raised interest rates aggressively. In the past few months, inflation has come right back down. So it looks like this was a transitory or one-off inflation episode after all. This should not be a surprise. The underlying conditions in the 70s were fundamentally different compared to today's world. Back then, before the globalization of our own time, workers had serious bargaining power, and firms, protected from global competition, could pass on increased wage costs into the prices they charge their customers. The threat of a wage price spiral today is an illusion. Now, some people might say inflation rates have subsided, but surely that is thanks to central banks raising interest rates. Well, my answer to that would be yes and no. Yes, there was a need to reduce demand somewhat. I'm not talking about the temporary demand distortion caused by the COVID stimulus. I am referring here rather to the structural shortage of labor supplied caused by population aging. Demand for labor, visible in job vacancies, has been exceeding the supply of labor. So all central banks needed to do was reduce that labor demand reflected in the overhang of vacancies. This would have been a sufficient contribution to what would in any case have been the organic resolution of post-COVID supply and demand imbalances. And now, vacancies have come right down. So there is a no part of my answer to the question about the necessity of the European Central Bank's interest rate increases. They didn't need to raise rates so high. And now they might well cause a recession. That is, with real job losses, not just a reduction in job vacancies. Even Mario Draghi has just publicly predicted this recession outcome. while the ECB denies the possibilities in its own official growth forecast. But economic data will expose their mistake. Just last week, for example, the headline reading for the Eurozone's Harmonized Consumer Price Index for October was 2.9%, compared to 12 months ago, down from 4.3% in September. But the European Central Bank interest rate is still 4.5%. They should be cutting rates already now. But Christine Lagarde says that rate cuts are out of the question for at least another 6 months. She has repeated the mistake of her French predecessor at the ECB, Jean-Claude Trichet, when he raised rates in the 2011 amidst the unfolding Eurozone sovereign debt crisis and renewed recession. One advice, always beware French bureaucrats when they get their hands on any levers, especially such a powerful lever as the interest rates. Perhaps the European Central Bank wanted to keep up with the US Federal Reserve in some kind of macho act to avoid any weakening of the euro that might then fuel inflation by making imports more expensive. If so, then this was another mistake. The best way to weaken the currency is to tip the European economy into recession. For in that case, markets will certainly punish the euro. The European economy is far too weak to be able to bear such high rates of interest in real terms. It did not have the same cushion as in the US, where families received substantial government handouts during COVID. The European economy is also much more sensitive than America to higher interest rates because of the variable interest rates of housing mortgages and of bank credit to firms. It is no wonder that European credit demand has collapsed. This looks ominous. A related European sensitivity is the high level of public debt. The rising cost of servicing that debt at present, excessively high interest rate, has revived worries about the sustainability of the public debt and the risk of another sovereign debt crisis. As usual, Italy is a focal point of such discussion, even if France deserved just as much scrutiny and concern. The educated public in Italy is probably better acquainted than elsewhere with the relationship between interest rates and growth as the key to the sustainability of public debt. If interest rates exceed economic growth rates, then government debt gets onto an unsustainable path. In Italy today, we see once again that interest rates are above the rate of economic growth. This brings me to the last point in my talk today. This is another key theme in my book 10 years ago. It can be simply summarized. Inflation is inextricably bound up with fiscal policy. That is, government budgets and specifically budget deficit. Examining this monetary fiscal nexus is an essential corrective to superficial readings of Milton Friedman's often quoted statement that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Think about it. If you start thinking about it, you will see that this formulation is not as informative as it may at first sound. While the evidence it rests on is straightforward, that is, periods of sustained high inflation invariably also see high rates of growth in the money supply, ultimately this is a tautology. It's not an explanation. It is like saying that the price of bananas is always and everywhere a banana phenomenon. I put this picture, I like the haircut. Yeah? Groundbreaking research on this subject of the close relationship between monetary and fiscal policy appeared in a paper published in 1981 by Thomas Sargent and Neil Valles, entitled Some Unpleasant Monetarist Arithmetic. This famous article focused on situations where governments are running permanent primary deficit. That is, their spending exceeds their revenue even after taking account of the sums they have to spend servicing their debt. This is the situation of Italy today, along with many other developed countries, including France, the UK, and last but not least, the United States. I will spare you the detailed argument here, but the unpleasant conclusion is that tightening monetary policy in these conditions does not decrease inflation, but actually increase it. In this situation, there are only two ways to prevent public debt having to be financed by the inflation tax, or in more everyday language, inflated away. The first method is to balance the budget by turning the primary deficit into a surplus. This is austerity. As Italy knows better than almost any other country, it was tried in the last decade and failed because it depresses growth, ruins productivity, and makes the budget situation even worse. The second solution is to increase growth above the level of interest rates, reversing the key relationship in a favorable sense, that is, interest rates are below the rate of economic growth. We are talking here about nominal growth, of course, which is comprised of inflation and real growth. So a measure of higher inflation can help, especially if it is kept under credible control. For this purpose, the inflation target should be raised from 2% to, say, 4%. But crucial also is higher real growth. And here we need the opposite of austerity, that is, public investment to boost productivity. Increased public spending can generate demand by financing projects to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or to make us less dependent on American weaponry, or to enhance infrastructure. Then there will be the rising cost of pensions and healthcare in aging population. I will leave you with an excellent comment that I spotted the other day on the social media formerly known as Twitter. I'm going to read it to you. Something that most economists don't realize but which is obvious to those who have worked in business, is that high demand induces productivity. When tons of people are trying to buy your product and service, you figure out ways to increase production with the tools available to you. I feel sure that this lucid thought will resonate in this room, which is full of business owners and entrepreneurs of all kinds who like to think and then to act. Thank you very much for listening to me.